And there's these words: startup, entrepreneur, innovation, and venture capital. I'd never heard of these. And I think most people, even those who tell you they've heard of them, they're probably telling you lies. But at the same time, this gentleman over here, Dr. Ravi Kumar, who set up a company called Exciton, he came to my lab. You need a product. HIV was important. Everything was being tested. And therefore, he wanted to make an HIV kit. And he said he would make a peptide-based HIV kit because that's the kit which is being made in America. But which peptides do you put in there? He had no idea. But then I think someone whispered in his ear, look at that paper and look at the first 2 peptides on table so-and-so. That's the one they're using. And so he came to me and said, can we make these peptides? This was what was innovation then. You know, it was just copying something, provided you had a little bit of information. And I know a lot of this still goes on. This conference, which actually marks 25 years of IKP, this is what I got. I got a title. She gave me the title. She said she'd like me to speak on the transformative power of scientific research. And I've just taken this extract from her email to me, and I've highlighted the words which I'd like to discuss: innovation, incubation, translation, innovators, and entrepreneurs. And it turned out that I probably had not heard any of these terms when Rakesh Mishra was a student at IISc. So one thing you will realize is that both Rakesh and I have aged considerably since then. Now, the slide itself is decorated on its corners by the pictures of people. I haven't put their names because I hope that some of them you will recognize, but I will tell you what their names are. There's Michael Faraday right up on the top left. There's C.V. Raman in the middle. There's Pasteur on the top right. And down below are 2 of our post-independent scientists, G.N. Ramachandran and Shambhunath Dey of Calcutta, all of them featured here. These are the scientists whose work very often I have read and whose work has always been completely inspirational. It actually transforms the way you think about science. May I have the next slide, please? What has science done which has led to technology, and how has that technology been useful to human beings? In his magnificent summary of human evolution over the course, and I say evolution, it's not biological evolution, it's really cultural evolution over the last 2,000 years, Jacob Bronowski, a mathematical physicist, many years ago in a BBC series in the 1970s, traced this evolutionary course. This, of course, is the evolution of science and the evolution of technology, which has actually led to the evolution of human cultures also. And in this, he says at the end, and I will read, that series of inventions, and here I've underlined the word inventions, by which man from age to age has remade his environment, is a different kind of evolution. It's not Darwinian evolution. It's not biological evolution. It's not biological, but cultural. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man. So here he will trace the beginnings of engineering, the beginnings of science, the beginnings of technology, and how it has brought us to the 20th century. And now, of course, we are a quarter of the way through the 21st century. But I want to take you back in time. This is 1939 now. And in 1939, this man, Abraham Flexner, who had a BA degree in the classics from Johns Hopkins University, he became famous in later years because the Carnegie Foundation asked him to write a report on medical research in America. and medical education in America. His report, published in 1910, transformed the American medical university. It transformed American medical education. He was not a clinician himself. He was not a scientist. He was a classicist. And it is on the basis of the Flexner report that American medical education was reformed and research became a central part of the American medical curriculum. If all of you here, many of you I know are interested in startups in the area of biomedical research, you must remember that clinical research in America over the last 100 years has been of a scale which has been unmatched in India over the last 75 years. So this is something that one must really think about. But in 1939, Flexner had moved from medicine. He had been invited again by Princeton University to now set up its new Center of Advanced Study in the sciences. And the Center of Advanced Study was a philanthropic endeavor. And what Flexner did was, he set this up. It's the Institute of Advanced Study which became very famous in theoretical sciences because one of the first persons attracted to that institute was Albert Einstein. And once Albert Einstein came there, and of course, as people would later on say, Flexner had a little bit of help from Adolf Hitler, because Hitler wanted to drive out all the Jews from Germany, and then Einstein had to go somewhere. He went to Princeton. And once Einstein went there, Gödel followed. And then slowly, many other mathematicians went there, including our own very Harish Chandra, who went from the Indian Institute of Science to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And what Flexner, 9 years after he'd set up the institute, just as the Second World War was about to start and the world was changing, he wrote he gave this wonderful talk, which is reproduced here in Harper's Magazine. It's called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. And as one who has practiced useless research for my entire career, I must stand before a lot of you who are practicing useful, applied, and economically important research. That research and science forms the basis for everything that is going to be useful in the future. He, in fact, recounts in this essay a conversation that he had with George Eastman. George Eastman was the man who founded Eastman Kodak. And Eastman asks him, they discuss what are the most important things in science at that time, what has come out. And Eastman said, the most important thing that has come out is Marconi's inventions on communication, the telephone and so on, radio, all of that. And of course, if you look at it, yes, the common person, what has impacted the most? It's electricity in the first years of the 20th century, and it's wireless communication in the last years of the 20th century. That's what's really impacted everybody, communication. Where did electricity come out? And Flexner explains to Eastman then, he says, you are giving Marconi too much credit. The credit must go to Clerk Maxwell, because Clerk Maxwell is the one who united electricity and magnetism in the first major unification in physics. We are still searching for the grand unification, which eluded physicists in the 20th century. But Maxwell's theory, out of Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism came light. And we immediately recognized the light is electromagnetic radiation. You can't have a more powerful insight than that. But who united electricity and magnetism? That was Michael Faraday. Faraday united electricity and magnetism in a very famous series of experiments that he demonstrated at the Royal Institution in London. A rotating magnetic field sets up an electric current in a coil close by, or a rotating electric field will now deflect a magnet. So there was a connection between electric and magnetic fields. In fact, when we talk about impact, Faraday had an enormous impact. Faraday also was responsible for a major invention in England, which most of you will not know about, and that was the invention of the one-way street. We are very common in Bangalore now. Every street is one way, so you never know where you're going. But in London, the very first street which became one way in the 19th century was the street in front of the Royal Institution. And the street in front of the Royal Institution was jammed because Victorian ladies in their long dresses would drive up to the entrance in their horse-drawn carriages, and they wouldn't walk very much. So after a while, the whole place was jammed with horse-drawn carriages. And the mayor of London then decreed that this street is one way. Why were they coming to the Royal Institution? They were coming to watch Michael Faraday do his experiments. And this is where Michael Faraday demonstrated combustion. This is where he demonstrated the connection between electricity and magnetism, which of course gave us electricity eventually. Science and engineering are really two sides of the same coin. We use many words: fundamental science, basic science, applied science, translational science, and so on. And now, since I've spent a lifetime moving in government circles, today I hear the word translational almost all the time. And you can see these cartoons. So to summarize what cartoonists think about all of this, and you can see when fire was first invented, it says it has heaps of apps. Today, of course, apps means something other than applications, but doesn't matter. I want to show you something that comes from the 12th class textbook. That's the global carbon cycle. If you look at nature as it is, animals and plants live in remarkable cohesion, a completely sustainable life. Animals breathe in the oxygen and breathe out the carbon dioxide. The plants, on the other hand, harvest the energy from the sun and produce oxygen. So there we are. We need energy for life. This is one thing you must remember. Biology rests on two words: information and energy. All of genomic technologies rely on information. The second most important thing for the living cell, or in fact I would say the most important thing for the living cell, is energy. Energy to do all the biosynthetic processes that are necessary for a cell to stay viable and a cell to stay alive. All of this is possible. This is possible, but that energy comes from the sun, which as far as we are concerned is an inexhaustible source of energy. We have to wait another 5 billion years before the sun dies out. But on our timescales, we cannot think of a sunless Earth. At that time, all life will come to an end. But what has happened really is science and technology, or what is called anthropogenic interventions, have now intervened. And what every one of our technologies does is it generates carbon dioxide. And then carbon dioxide levels go up, and therefore we have now interfered with nature's sustainability. The result of this is that curve up on top is the Keeling curve. Now, why do I put the Keeling curve here? It was produced by a geochemist, Charles Keeling, in the 1950s and 1960s because he was measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What was he interested in? He was interested in studying the equilibrium between calcium carbonate and lime and the dissolved bicarbonate in seawater. And he was measuring carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. He was interested in chemical equilibria. He realized then that over a period of time, carbon dioxide levels were going up. His funding was stopped. Eventually, he continued his measurements with his own money. And at some point or the other, when people realized it was important, the American government took over. And so we have the Keeling curve. Today, of course, the Keeling curve is responsible for more international conferences than any other measurement that has been made in chemistry, biology, or physics. And climate change is a result of the Keeling curve. But we knew, even in the early days, that carbon dioxide will in fact absorb and trap heat. This was known. This was known by Arrhenius. It was known even before Arrhenius. And this was actually written down in the literature. And this is why science is sometimes important. Science can drive geopolitics in a way that you cannot imagine You can't imagine what will happen in the future. Today, for example, when the Union Cabinet approves the green hydrogen mission, something 14,000 crores or 23,000 crores or something, some big figure like this, you can ask, what is green hydrogen? It's going to come as a result of research. It's going to come as a result of new technologies. But will this green hydrogen really be green? Can you have a technology that does not produce carbon dioxide? How much carbon dioxide will be produced when you make all of this? This is something that one needs to analyze. You can't do this unless you understand the underlying science behind this. One thing you must remember, the Americans always have a very understandable phrase for they're very practical people. They will say there's no such thing like a free lunch. And no political dispensation can in fact offer you a free lunch. Look at things which have come from science. Mendeleev and the periodic table. Today we are driven only by two things. We're driven by two elements. Carbon, which drives all of life and all of biology and all of the biomedicine that you think about, and silicon, which drives all the information technologies that are ruling our lives. And an understanding of this will actually tell you the breadth and scope and the transformative power that science has had over the 20th century. And for much of what has happened in the 20th century, we are in fact indebted to what has happened in the 19th century, in the 18th century and the 17th century and before. Where do all these elements that we are using come from? They only come from the stars. It doesn't take much to understand that every element that we use in every technology is mined from the earth. It was the earth's inheritance when it was born. We do not generate the elements here. Unless we recycle them, there will be a time when the elements will run out. The elements for high technology will run out. The elements for all the technologies that you use on a day-to-day basis will also run out at some time in the future. It is that future that you think of when you plan to completely transform the world using science. Translational research, everybody knows. This phrase, bench to bedside, is my favorite. I would prefer bedside to bench to bedside. And I think that is what is done when you have a collaboration of clinical scientists with basic scientists. And that's absolutely necessary. You know, there are things like, what problem are we going to solve with all this research is something that we must think about. The cartoonists usually think of everything before you've thought of them. And therefore, it's very useful in Google, if you're going to search for something, always add cartoon after that and read what the cartoonists have had to say. This is the historical timeline of biochemistry. I was introduced as a biochemist. I was not a biochemist to begin with. The Department of Biochemistry, the oldest biochemistry department at IISc, never recognized me as a biochemist. But fortunately for me, Wikipedia did, so everybody uses that. I've divided from 1875 onwards, that's about 150 years, 25-year intervals, the evolution of biochemistry. And this is the historical timeline. For the first 50 years, we had the microbe hunters, the connection between microorganisms and disease. Pasteur, Koch, a very romantic phase of biological research. Between 1925 and 1950, it was all nutritional biochemistry. That was when all the vitamins were discovered. And this was because nutritional deficiencies as a cause of disease, not infection, was recognized. Between 1950 and 1975, it was realized that the vitamins were necessary, but nobody knew what they were doing. And therefore, you had to find the enzymes, because the vitamins all turned out to be coenzymes. That was the decades of the enzyme hunters. Wonderfully summarized in Arthur Kornberg's autobiography. Between 1975 and 2000, 25 years which I saw, everybody was hunting genes. Ever since Boyer and Cohen cloned the first gene for insulin, it turned out that everyone was hunting genes. Genes for disease, genes for everything. Now, biochemistry suddenly became molecular biology, and then, of course, I became a biochemist. But after 2000, I put a question mark. And all of you who have been around, I hope, or many of you have been around, some of you have been around for much shorter than some of the others, but Rakesh and I have certainly seen all the 25 years. The question is, what would you write there? And I leave it to you. If you have any suggestions for me, then please let me know, and I will add it to my slide. Now, the words which puzzled me in Dipanvita's letter of invitation, I've already told you. I'd never heard of them. And I wanted to know, when did I heard of them? They were words as yet unknown to me in 1994. And I think IKP came somewhat later. And there's these words: startup, entrepreneur, innovation, and venture capital. I'd never heard of these. And I think most people, even those who tell you they've heard of them, they're probably telling you lies. But at the same time, this gentleman over here, Dr. Ravi Kumar, who set up a company called Exciton, he came to my lab. He was an old student of the biochemistry department, and he was interested. He wanted to make money, and he wanted to sell something. You need a product. HIV was important. Everything was being tested, and therefore he wanted to make an HIV kit. And he said he would make a peptide-based HIV kit, because that's the kit which is being made in America. But which peptides do you put in there? He had no idea. But then I think someone whispered in his ear, look at that paper and look at the first 2 peptides on table so-and-so. That's the one they're using. And so he came to me and said, can we make these peptides? This was what was innovation then. You know, it was just copying something, provided you had a little bit of information. And I know a lot of this still goes on. But, so we made the peptides, and Ravi Kumar did all the rest. He coated ELISA plates with them and standardized things. He was a clinician, trained as a clinician. Therefore, he had the help to get all the tests done. Then, of course, we ran into the regulatory problems. Then it turned out that in India, the regulatory problems in those days were fairly easily sorted out. You found someone who was influential. And one day, Ravi Kumar found out that from the village where he came from, somebody had become a member of parliament, and then he located him, went to him, and over a period of time, it was released. He began to sell. He had a company. He later on became a recognized... I always thought of him as a person who was doing business. And when we talked about Mr. Narayan Murthy in those days, we thought he was doing a business. We knew people who were doing business, because there's a difference between them and scientists. Scientists were not making money. Those who were doing business were making money. This was the difference. We hadn't heard of the word entrepreneur. And now I realized that I should describe Ravi Kumar as a physician, scientist, turned technocrat was how I described him the last time. Now I should also put him as one of the early entrepreneurs before I learned what the word really meant. May I have the next slide, please? So I have a little bit of experience with this kind of what you might call innovation. And I found this called Google Ngram Viewer some time ago, which will tell you the word occurrence over a long period of times. Google's databases are frighteningly large, and it turns out that they do this. And I put in the words that I was interested in: translational research. And you can see translational research has come very, very recently. I've put a historical timeline there. All the people who are featured on my first slide did their work at some point or the other. They were neither innovators nor were they doing translational research. And here it is. Then I realized it was only when I'd moved into the upper reaches of IISc's administration had was this everybody understanding what is translational research. I still remember Dr. Mashelka's famous battle to get a patent for turmeric, which is the one which made all of us understand what patents meant. Unfortunately, some of us probably understood what it meant somewhat better than others. Here it is. This is a control experiment. You always need to do control experiments. That's what we're taught in biochemistry. So I put in 2 words, communism and capitalism. And you can see this now tells you how geopolitics has changed over the years. Everybody's forgotten communists except in Kerala. Even the Bengalis, who have a fairly long memory, have forgotten them. The other 3 words, this is what they meant to me. Discovery meant Alexander Fleming and penicillin. Invention meant Edison and the light bulb. Relativity might also be an invention of the human mind. Innovation meant the retail store. Today, innovation would mean Swiggy or Zomato or Amazon, because it is an innovation. So there's a difference between invention and innovation. But now if you look at these words, you can see innovation is zooming, and discovery is sort of static. Invention is actually coming down. And you will remember that Bronowski used the word invention, not the word innovation, in the 1970s. To justify my ignorance, I realized that even the word entrepreneur, in the early days, nobody knew how to pronounce it. And we sort of stumbled over it. And then I found that everybody knew what to say after some time. So the word had become a common. Venture capital, venture centers, the word venture, that also entered. And startup, of course, now everybody uses it. Even the politicians use it. Now you can ask the question, is science being drowned by imagination? So I put Einstein, Frankenstein, and Sherlock Holmes into this. Google's a marvelous device. And it turns out that today, there are more people mentioning Frankenstein and Sherlock Holmes than they're mentioning Einstein. So the result is you can see what the state of science is, and therefore we must be worried about science before we worry about transformative science. This is the normal unrealistic sequence with which those who invest money worry about. You do some science, it must lead to some technology at the end of it. It turns out that this is not really possible. It's been said a long time ago that without scientific progress, no amount of achievement in other directions can ensure our health, prosperity, and security. That was Vannevar Bush in 1946 in his famous report, The Endless Frontier. The other thing to remember is this old aphorism that success in the laboratory does not always translate into success in the marketplace. That is something that many young entrepreneurs do not really recognize, and they are sometimes very disappointed. Translational research is a problem everywhere. Academia is asked to do translational research for which it is often untrained. And there is a gap between development and research. And it turns out that this is an article from Science, says diverting basic scientists academia to tasks for which they and their environments are unsuited. This is happening to a great extent in India. So everybody should do really what they are best at doing, what they really understand. Technology transforms everything. Look at the costs of acquiring genomic information. Today we are awash in information. We can't use it. We can't use it usefully. We don't know how to use it. In the case of computer science, Moore said this, now called Moore's Law, completely violated in the case of the costs of genomic sequencing. So there are many technological advances which are moving very, very fast. As a result of it, we have lots of information. Here, for example, you see the kind of crystallographic data that we have. For proteins, for small molecules, everybody wanting to make drugs, do docking, use the latest one, AlphaFold 3 or whatever it is, to do biomolecular interactions. You can do it because you have so much data. This year's Nobel Prize for AlphaFold in artificial intelligence is not possible without all this data which is there in the protein data bank and all the sequence data which is there in the National Center for Biotechnology Information's databases. This is the new AlphaFold, right? 2024. Everybody is now going to come forward with saying that we now have a prediction for drug design, we have a new molecule, we have a new use for an old molecule, and there we are. We're going to start a company. The background for this will be to use a black box artificial intelligence program in which very little input will actually come from the people themselves. You can ask a question as nature did at the turn of the millennium, 2000. What's the most important scientific advance of the 20th century? Different people wrote in their essays, the double helix, nuclear fission, all of that. But this is the one that stayed in my mind. Václav Smil environmental scientist, wrote this. He said that the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century was the Haber-Bosch process for the synthesis of ammonia. And I'll tell you why. Because he says that the world's population would not have grown without this process. Nitrogen and hydrogen compressed at high temperature, catalyst. This is something that you've read in school. Everybody hated studying the Haber-Bosch process. I did too. And when I saw this in the year 2000, I was really taken aback. Nature does it much better. We haven't yet replaced the Haber-Bosch process 100 years after it has come. It's a highly carbon dioxide producing process. But it makes us urea, makes us fertilizer. All the famines have disappeared as a result. The first agricultural revolution of the 20th century is a chemical revolution. The second agricultural revolution of the 20th century, the Green Revolution, is a biological revolution. But sometimes science does things. DDT was transformative. In one shot, DDT got rid of the mosquitoes causing malaria. It also got rid of the pests which were causing problems in agriculture production. Can you imagine the Department of Biotechnology sitting with a molecule which affects both agricultural biotechnology and medical biotechnology? They would have jumped at it. Everybody did. But what did DDT produce? It produced Rachel Carson's silent spraying and the beginning of the environmental movement in the 1960s. So there's a cost to be paid in every technological advancement. This is a question that everybody asks. We all ask this. Because can new technologies emerge in an environment that does not support science? If your answer is yes, then we have a bright future. Raman discovered the Raman effect in 1928. His Nobel Prize is 1930. Did he know when he died in 1970, 40 years after his Nobel Prize, that the Raman effect was useful? The answer is no, he did not know. Because the laser had just been invented. And it was only when we had higher intensity laser sources that Raman effect had so many applications which are now there in the 21st century. I'll show you two examples. Both, these are the starting points of what is today's diagnostic radiology. Röntgen's first discovery of X-rays, cathode ray experiments, sees a fluorescent spot on a plate, calls his wife in, asks her to put her hand, gets the image down at the bottom. He's discovered X-rays. Did the physicists think X-rays were important? No. But clinicians immediately thought the X-rays were important because they could visualize the skeleton, so you know when a bone is broken or not. So X-rays entered medicine before X-rays entered physics. The result of this is von Lauy's experiment on diffraction in crystals, which led to the Bragg's discovery of crystallography itself, was preceded by applications in the area of medicine. And I'll show you one. I saw this picture when I was a graduate student. This is an image, an NMR image, of two concentric tubes of water produced by inhomogeneous magnetic field gradients in inhomogeneous magnetic fields. But it turns out that Lauterber's experiment, which was explained to us as graduate students, we had no idea what this was. And our general conclusions after listening to this, and we were trained to some extent, I was new, but there were senior students there, was that this could have possibly no application whatsoever. After all, I've put in two tubes, concentric tubes of water. What's the use of imaging them? I can see them. The result of this, of course, is magnetic resonance imaging. The only advance from the early 1970s to now is this, that we dropped the word nuclear because it had a bad connotation, and we now call it MRI. MRI, everybody will go into a machine. If it was an NMRI, nobody will enter the machine. Lastly, most of you should have seen this book on Pasteur's quadrant, written by an American political scientist. Before he died before the book was published in 1997. This tells you what the quadrant is. Along the x-axis you have use-inspired research. Along the y-axis you have fundamental research. All of research space is divided into 4 quadrants. And he named them. He named 3 quadrants, I've named the 4. All the coloring is mine. And his was a black and white picture which only had names on it. The top left is fundamental research, what he called the Bohr quadrant. Would anybody have thought that an understanding of the atomic spectrum of the hydrogen atom and the spectral lines in hydrogen have any consequence on physics and its application? Nobody. Eventually that led to the revolution in quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and the entire physics revolution of the first half of the 20th century. Edison at the bottom could have discovered the electron, but instead of discovering the electron, Edison was focused on invention. He was an inventor, and he discovered the light bulb. He illuminated our lives. So that's called the Edison quadrant. The top right quadrant is the Pasteur quadrant, after which the book derives its name. That's because Pasteur did the fundamental work in organic stereochemistry, which is the starting point for understanding of chirality in organic chemistry and biochemistry. Everything about molecules and molecular asymmetry, long before structures were known and chemistry had advanced. He also is the founding father of microbiology and the man who gave us our ideas about infectious disease, vaccines, and so on. So that's highest fundamental research and highest application. That's the Pasteur quadrant. All of us are in the bottom left quadrant, and we would like to get there. So the image that I've used there is R.K. Lakshman's iconic common man. And that's where average industrial R&D is, academic R&D is, and we'd all like to find our way in research space. That's what you're doing. This is academic space. I come from an educational institution. Our job is only to train people and then ask the question whether we've trained Rakesh Mishra well, or whether we've trained Ullas Koltur well, or maybe any other IISc student who's here. We are judged really by our output, and our output eventually turns out to be only human beings. I was asked many years ago as the director of the Indian Institute of Science, Mr. Ratan Tata was also present because the president of the court, the press asked me, Mr. Tata has produced the nano, what have you produced? I have no answer to that. If Mr. Tata had been an alumnus of the institute, I would have said we have produced Mr. Tata. So educational institutions take credit for their alumni. That's their product. But how do we go up in this space where we have the best research and the best teaching? That's what we have to really find out. Remember, as I conclude, that the two dominant technologies of our time, information technology and biotechnology, both have their roots in fundamental science. Information technology's birth can be traced to Claude Shannon's famous work on the mathematical theory of communication. His PhD thesis, interestingly, is called An Algebra for Theoretical Genetics, and that's in 1940. And of course, Oswald Avery's discovery of DNA as a genetic material was in 1944. So you can see information and genetics were even connected as far back as the 1940s. And so today, when you do all the genomics that you all do, you need more powerful computers to store genomic information and handle them than for many other activities. You might actually pay a tribute to both Shannon and to Avery. This, of course, is Mr. Vajpayee. He quoted Jawaharlal Nehru, who said scientists are a minority in league with the future. And he said, this is true, but let us also remember that a bright future can be realized only when science is in league with the majority of our society, which is, in fact, a wonderful statement to actually think about. The other thing we must remember about transformative science is that it's science that not only creates wealth, but also improves the human condition. And therefore, our job really, when we think about transformative science, we generate knowledge, and knowledge is there in the title of the IKP itself. Where does knowledge lead? Knowledge can lead to wealth, and knowledge can also lead to wisdom. But the connection between wealth and wisdom sometimes are tenuous, and is something that maybe it's a bridge that needs to be built in India in the future. Thank you very much.
To stay informed about the startup ecosystem, subscribe to my Startup TV.